The California wildfires were unstoppable, moving through the hills like a monster. What started as a few small fires quickly turned into a raging inferno, spreading through the dry hills and brush. It wasn't just the forests that were at risk. Wealthy neighborhoods near Malibu, including the exclusive area where Damian Rinaldi's mansion stood, were in the fire's path. The sky turned dark with smoke as the fire crept closer to the estate. Damian Rinaldi was a name everyone in the city knew, but few truly understood. He had built an empire through his work in real estate and business dealings, but rumors about his ties to the Mafia were even more widespread. People said that his mansion, set high on a hill with a view of the Pacific Ocean, was not just a home, but a fortress, hiding secrets behind its stone walls and tall gates. No one had dared to approach the place in years, and its large grounds were surrounded by high fences and security cameras that watched every move. On that particular afternoon, as the fire grew closer, emergency crews and firefighters worked tirelessly, trying to protect the area from the flames. The fire was spreading quickly, and the winds were not in their favor. The fire department had a list of homes in danger, and the Rinaldi estate was on it. They needed to make sure everyone had evacuated, but something about this house felt different. The thick smoke made it hard to see, and the heat from the fire was unbearable, but they had to get inside. As the firefighters approached the front gates, they could hear the crackling of the fire in the distance. It was only a matter of time before it reached the mansion. They knocked on the doors, yelling for anyone inside to leave, but there was no response. A few of the firefighters pulled out their equipment, ready to break the doors open. The mansion was empty, at least they thought so. The last thing they expected to find was a girl locked in a basement. After several attempts, the doors finally gave way with a loud crash. The firefighters stepped inside, coughing from the smoke. The mansion was eerily quiet, and the smell of burnt wood was thick in the air. The smoke inside made it hard to breathe, but they pushed forward, carefully moving through the house. It was huge, with dark wood floors and high ceilings, and nothing seemed out of place, but something felt wrong. They moved to the basement, drawn by a faint sound they heard coming from the bottom of the stairs. It was weak at first, almost like a soft cry. The firefighter leading the team waved for the others to follow, and they descended into the dark, musty space below. The basement was cold, even though the heat from the fire outside was unbearable. As they reached the bottom, their flashlights caught a glimpse of something strange. There, in a small corner, they saw a cage. The firefighter's heart dropped when he saw a young girl, curled up inside the cage. She was thin and covered in dirt. Her hair was tangled, and she looked like she hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. Her eyes were wide with fear as she stared at them. The firefighter quickly stepped forward, trying to comfort her. "Hey, it's okay. We're here to help you," he said, kneeling by the cage. The girl didn't respond, but she looked at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. She seemed too weak to speak, and her body trembled with every movement. "We need medical help here now," the firefighter shouted to the others. It was clear that the girl needed immediate care, but there was something even more troubling than her condition. She didn't look like someone who had simply been lost in a fire. This was something darker. The team managed to unlock the cage and helped her out. She was so frail that they had to support her as they led her out of the basement and back toward the light of the outside world. The fire was still burning nearby, but the girl who had been trapped in that dark cage was safe for now. The firefighters and paramedics quickly wrapped her in blankets, trying to keep her warm. As they placed her in the ambulance, she said only one thing, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been locked in there for so long." The ambulance sped off toward the hospital, and the firefighters watched it disappear into the distance. But the question remained, who was this girl, and why had she been kept locked in a cage in the basement of a mansion? The discovery would soon unravel a story far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Emily Parker had been missing for 3 long years. When she was found in that cage, it wasn't just the firefighters who were stunned, it was the entire community. Her parents had given up hope. The authorities had closed the case, convinced that Emily was one of many lost in the chaos of life, presumed dead or simply vanished. They had no answers, no clues. And then, in the midst of a disaster, she was found alive but broken, far from the life she once knew. The ambulance carrying Emily rushed through the streets, her thin body wrapped in a blanket, as paramedics worked to keep her stable. Her wide, fearful eyes barely moved as the world around her spun. She was in shock, unable to grasp the reality of what was happening. The smoke, the flames, and the fire trucks that rushed by, none of it seemed real. Her mind had been trapped for so long that reality felt like a dream. At the hospital, Emily was admitted immediately. Doctors and nurses surrounded her, trying to assess her condition, but her frailty told a heartbreaking story. She was malnourished and dehydrated, her skin pale and her body weak. It was clear that she had been kept in isolation for years. The doctors could do little for her physically, but it was the emotional scars that they knew would be the hardest to heal. When Emily's parents arrived at the hospital, they barely recognized her. Her once bright eyes were now dull and filled with fear. Her mother, nearly in tears, reached out to touch her daughter's face, but Emily flinched. The emotional distance was too great, the trauma too deep. Her mother spoke her name softly, trying to reassure her, but Emily remained silent, her eyes looking past them as if she couldn't fully process their presence. After a few hours, Emily spoke. Her voice was weak and shaky, barely above a whisper. I don't remember much. It's all so blurry." She paused, as if struggling to find the words. "I was locked in a cage." Her voice trembled at the memory, and she shuddered, staring at the floor. "I don't know how long, maybe 3 years." The detective in charge of the case, Detective Laura Harris, was present when Emily began to speak. Emily's words were barely coherent at first, but Harris knew that if she could get the girl to trust her, the details would start to come out. She sat beside Emily's bed, speaking gently. "We're going to find out who did this to you, Emily, but we need your help. Can you tell us what happened? Can you tell us who hurt you?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room. He said I was special, that I was meant for something important. I didn't understand." She paused again, her breathing shallow as she recalled the memories. "He kept me locked in that basement, told me to stay quiet. There were other rooms in the house, but I was never allowed to see them." Detective Harris scribbled notes as Emily spoke, trying to make sense of her disjointed statements. It was clear that Damien Rinaldi, the owner of the mansion, had been the one to keep Emily prisoner, but there were many unanswered questions. Why had he chosen her? What was his plan? Why had he kept her alive when there were no signs of ransom or any attempt to contact her family? As Emily started to regain her strength, she remembered more pieces of the puzzle. She recalled faint conversations she overheard from the basement, but the details were still hazy. She had heard him on the phone several times, speaking in a low voice. "It's almost time. The plan is coming together," he would say, his words cryptic and filled with a sense of urgency. "She doesn't know yet, but she will be part of something much bigger." Emily couldn't understand at first, but the more she spoke, the more the truth became clear. She wasn't just a random victim. Damien Rinaldi had planned her captivity carefully, keeping her alive for reasons she couldn't yet comprehend. Detective Harris knew the answers were out there. She just needed to find them before it was too late. As Emily's story began to take shape, the authorities realized they were dealing with something far darker than a simple case of kidnapping. Damien Rinaldi was no ordinary man. His name had been whispered in criminal circles for years. He was wealthy, powerful, and dangerous, and now they were beginning to uncover just how deep his criminal activities went. The mansion where Emily had been kept was the key. It wasn't just a luxurious estate, it was a hub for Rinaldi's operations. The police began their investigation, searching the property thoroughly. The mansion was full of hidden rooms, locked doors, and secret passageways. Every room they uncovered seemed to hold a new piece of the puzzle. In one of the rooms, they found documents, files, and photographs detailing missing women, all young, all with the same tragic story. They had been taken, just like Emily. Some had been gone for months, others for years, but all of them had been victims of the same man. Rinaldi had carefully catalogued his victims, and Emily had been one of many. The police also found evidence that Rinaldi's empire extended far beyond his mansion. There were financial documents linking him to illegal activities, money laundering, smuggling, arms trading. Rinaldi had connections all over the world, and his reach was vast. It became clear that he wasn't just a rich businessman. He was a key player in a much larger criminal network. He wasn't just keeping young women locked away for his own pleasure, he was using them for something far more sinister. But the investigation was slow. The police knew they were chasing a ghost. Damien Rinaldi was nowhere to be found. The fire had been the perfect cover for his escape. The flames that had nearly destroyed his mansion had also wiped away any trace of where he had gone. He had vanished without a trace, but his empire remained intact. Emily's memories of Rinaldi were beginning to come together. She remembered hearing him speak of something called the next step. She didn't fully understand what it meant, but she recalled his urgency in his voice. It was clear now that Rinaldi had big plans for her. She wasn't just a captive, she was part of something much larger, something that involved more than just his twisted desires. The police were working around the clock to piece everything together. Detective Harris knew that finding Rinaldi was only part of the equation. They needed to bring down his entire operation before it was too late. But with every passing day, the trail grew colder. And as much as Emily wanted to forget her captivity and move on, she knew she wasn't safe. Rinaldi was still out there and he was watching. The investigation would take months, but one thing was clear, the nightmare wasn't over. The more they uncovered, the more terrifying it became. And as Emily sat in her hospital room, trying to make sense of everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that Rinaldi wasn't done with her yet. He had a plan, and she was part of it. Weeks passed, and the investigation into Damien Rinaldi's disappearance hit a dead end. Despite the efforts of Detective Laura Harris and her team, there were no signs of Rinaldi. His mansion had been searched thoroughly, but no new clues had surfaced. The fire, which had nearly destroyed his estate, had effectively erased any trace of him. It was as though he had disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of his criminal empire. Emily, still recovering from her ordeal, was placed under protective custody, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed menacing. Every strange sound made her heart race. Rinaldi's disappearance wasn't the end of her nightmare. It was just another chapter in a terrifying story. She had been kept hidden from the world for so long, and now, even though she was free from the cage, she felt trapped again. There was no place safe enough. Rinaldi's influence seemed to stretch far beyond his mansion, and his disappearance had only deepened the mystery. In the days following the fire, Emily had been flooded with messages, not from Rinaldi himself, but from unknown sources connected to his criminal network. Cryptic notes, mysterious phone calls, and disturbing letters arrived at the safe house where Emily was staying. The messages were always brief, always ominous, and always signed with the same symbol, the emblem of Rinaldi's hidden empire. Each message made it clear that Rinaldi's absence was part of a larger plan, one that was still unfolding. At first, the authorities believed the messages were a desperate attempt by Rinaldi's allies to regroup. But the more they analyzed the content, the more they realized that Rinaldi was no longer in control. Someone else, someone powerful, was trying to fill the void left by his disappearance. And the messages to Emily were clear: she was still involved, whether she liked it or not. Detective Harris's investigation led her to a disturbing discovery. She found that Rinaldi had planned his vanishing act meticulously. The fire had been set deliberately, a calculated move to destroy his mansion and erase all evidence of his presence. But it was more than that. Rinaldi had disappeared into a network of hidden safe houses, leaving behind a trail that only those closest to him could follow. He had known that the authorities would be coming, and he had planned for it. Everything had been a part of his larger game. Emily's fear grew as she realized that Rinaldi's disappearance wasn't just about him escaping. He had set the stage for something far worse. His empire wasn't collapsing, it was evolving. The people who had worked for him were still out there, still following his orders, and still intent on carrying out his plans. The real horror was that, even though Rinaldi was gone, his criminal network was far from finished. Emily's involvement in this web of crime was far from over. Despite everything, she felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Her experiences had left her emotionally scarred, but the more she learned, the more she realized that Rinaldi's empire had been more than just a series of illegal businesses. It was a web of control, manipulation, and power. And now, without Rinaldi at the center, the people who had once worked for him were fighting to take over. The quiet of the safe house was unsettling. Emily had spent weeks trying to recover, but the sense of dread never fully left her. The messages from Rinaldi's network kept coming, more frequent and more threatening with each passing day. It was clear now that Rinaldi's disappearance had been part of a much bigger plan, one that involved her. He hadn't just kept her locked away for his personal gain, he had groomed her to be a key player in his criminal empire. But Emily wasn't the frightened girl who had been locked in a cage for 3 years. She had changed. The time spent in captivity had given her a new perspective on life, a sense of determination that burned brightly in her chest. She refused to let Rinaldi's shadow continue to control her life. It was time to take back the power that had been stolen from her. The authorities were doing their best to track down the remnants of Rinaldi's empire, but Emily knew that they would never succeed unless she took a more active role. Her knowledge of his network was her greatest asset, and she was determined to use it. One night, as Emily sat in her room, a new letter arrived. It was just like the others, cryptic, threatening, and bearing the same symbol. But this time, the message was different. It was personal. It read, "You think you've escaped, but I've only just begun. The game is still in play, Emily, and you're a part of it now." The letter sent chills down her spine, but it also filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't hide anymore. She had to confront the people who were still following Rinaldi's orders, the people who thought they could control her. She had been part of their game for far too long, and it was time to turn the tables. With the help of Detective Harris, Emily began to piece together the final elements of Rinaldi's plan. She learned that his empire had been built not just on criminal activities, but on a network of powerful individuals in positions of authority. Rinaldi had carefully placed his allies in key places within government, business, and law enforcement. The authorities had no idea how deep the corruption went. Emily's discovery was shocking. Rinaldi had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes, using his network to control the flow of information and manipulate those in power. But now, with Rinaldi gone, the remaining players were desperate to maintain their hold over the empire. They saw Emily not as a victim, but as a potential ally. They believed that, with her knowledge, she could help them rebuild what Rinaldi had left behind. The authorities, realizing that Emily might be the only one who could help bring down the remaining members of Rinaldi's network, began to work closely with her. But Emily wasn't content to sit back and wait for the police to act. She knew that if she wanted to bring down Rinaldi's empire, she had to take matters into her own hands. The final confrontation came when Emily, using the information she had gathered, led the authorities to a hidden facility where Rinaldi's allies were planning their next move. The facility was heavily guarded, but Emily knew how to navigate the shadows, how to use her knowledge of the network to stay one step ahead. As the police closed in on the facility, Emily's heart raced. She was about to face the remnants of the empire that had held her captive for so long, but this time she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The door to the facility slammed open, and Emily stepped into the unknown, determined to take down the last remnants of the Mafia's power.